Canadian society is starting to come to terms with some parts of our history and open our eyes to some different aspects of it. I think part of it is the accumulation of knowledge within my profession of the archaeology of the boreal forest, right? Going from 20 years ago thinking that it was this vast empty wilderness with just a few sites here and there where sparse groups of people lived, to realizing, oh no, like this was a fully populated landscape for 15,000 plus years.
Hey folks, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. I'm Matthew Kristoff. I'm excited for you all to be here today. On this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. Now, today's episode was a really fun one for me. I got to speak to someone who I've spoken with before on the podcast. His name is Kurtis Blaikie-Birkigt, and he is an archaeologist for Tree Time Services here in Edmonton. And I wanted to bring him on because I've heard him talk a couple times at a few events and really followed him online and social media to see what they've been finding, the kind of things they've been digging up. And over the past 4 years since I spoke with him last, archaeology in the boreal forest has exploded. And there's just been so many findings of Indigenous people's lives throughout the boreal forest, like densely throughout the boreal forest, that it's changing the entire way that we think about how the boreal forest was occupied before settlement. And it changes everything. We kind of thought it was this untouched landscape for a long time with, the odd group of First Nations people here and there. But no, it was entirely covered in First Nations people for a long, thousands and thousands of years. And that totally changes the way that we should be thinking about the forest and our relationship with it, right? So people have been here for thousands and thousands of years. That changes the way we need to think about how we interact with the forest now today, and changes the way that we can perceive how we can interact with it, right? Changes how we can imagine how well we can interact with the forest. And it's just a really exciting concept. So I wanted to bring Kurtis on to talk about all of that and his personal journey with that, his concept of nature and how that's changed throughout his lifetime and throughout his career. And it was just a really cool conversation. You guys are going to love it. It was a lot of fun. Yeah, Kurtis is great. And sponsors for this episode, West Fraser is the number one sponsor for 2021. Without them, this would not be possible. So thank you very much, West Fraser, for all your support. Greenlink Forestry is a secondary sponsor. Again, couldn't do this without them. They've been with you since the beginning, and I really appreciate everything they've done. So thank you, Greenlink. And Damaged Timber is a company out of Edmonton, Alberta, and they're selling damaged timber that you can put in your kitchen. So they go out, cut down wildfire burnt wood, turn it into something cool that you can put in your kitchen, like a butcher block or charcuterie board, something like that. It's really awesome. I love it. Check them out, damagedtimber.com. If you put in Your Forest 10 at checkout, you can get 10% off. So yeah, without any further messing around, let's dive into this conversation with Kurtis, all about archaeology and the way it changes our understanding of history and our understanding of our relationship with nature. Here we go.
Thinking about what to talk about, kind of one of the ways to get into this, I think, is, so we've got a blog, right? And since COVID hit this winter, our number one blog page, the number one article on our blog has been, "Why does archaeology matter?" And
that's exactly what I asked you, I think, the first time we talked.
Yeah, and it's a question that's come up a few times in my career, and it's a good way, I think, for me to think about how I answer that question has really changed over the course of the last 20 years. So I think it's really popular right now because people are doing online classes and looking for answers to assignments or something. But anyways, it's come up again, and I've got a different answer now than I did 20 years ago when I was I was asked. It was one of the questions in my my master's thesis defense.
Okay.
It was the one question that completely stumped me.
Isn't that funny? It's like,
Yeah.
it should be the simplest, but when you ask those big meta questions, it's kind of more, it's hard to pinpoint, right? Like you can feel it, you know why in your heart, like, so to speak, right? But you can't put it on paper, put it into words, make it solid. It's like it's a weird ethereal feeling. You're like, well, and trying any attempt to try and explain it seems clumsy and not quite on point. I know what you mean.
Yeah. And so right now, I think archaeology matters in a different way now. And some of the stuff that I've heard you talking with other people on the podcast about, in terms of kind of relationships to the forest and that. So I thought what I'd like to talk about today is a little bit about like my history of working in the forest and how that's changed and how that's interrelated with my career in archaeology and and eventually get to the point of why I think archaeology in the forest kind of matters right now in some ways. For sure. Well, that sounds great. Yeah, I have a little bit of a roadmap here just to kind of get us, just some questions to get us going, right? So I thought first I would just kind of set the scene for the listeners about how this conversation came about, and just how, and I'll just explain myself a little better to you too, right? So, but I think we're on the same page. Over the course of the last 4 years, over the course of this podcast, and with some other opportunities in that, I've become increasingly aware of the like First Nations perspectives and not just First Nations perspectives, but just different perspectives on the forest. And I've been increasingly aware of the not narrow view, but the fact that I only really have one perspective on the forest, and I need to increase that and become more comprehensive with my understanding if I want to make real change. And the opportunities that have come up for me have been ones that have really brought me to appreciate First Nations perspectives on the forest and the relationship with it. And I think it's not one that's typical. It's not a perspective that's typical in the industry and that kind of thing. And I think noticing that, I realized that the industry itself, one of the, forestry, for example, has some of the biggest impact on the forest in Canada. And yet we might not have the whole picture, right? And I think in order to have the whole picture, we need to start including more and more of these conversations about the history and how we got here, why it is the way it is. And I think that perspective comes with a lot of First Nations people's understanding and traditional knowledge that we aren't privy to and we don't know. And that's only been solidified for me as my relationships with some First Nations people who have traditional knowledge that they've shared with me. And I've slowly come to realize that, yes, my perspective was a little short-sighted, not wrong necessarily, but just was lacking depth, lacking more perspective, I guess, right? So through that whole process, I wanted to talk to you, right? And talk to you about the archaeological finds that you guys have found in the last few years, because I know it's increased so much, and our understanding, Western science's understanding of First Nations people in the boreal forest has changed a lot since the last time we talked, and I think it was 2017. So to dive into this, let's just talk about you for a second. Like, what drives you? What drives your passion and like your desire to do this work? Why do you continue to do it, and how does it fulfill you? Oh, I guess you're jumping right into the big one. So,
I think it's, I think it's, you don't have to answer the whole thing. Like, I know you want to kind of get to it near the end, but just, I'm more just like, how did you get here and why do you keep doing it? Right?
Yeah. And that's, so starting off with, it was just like curiosity, right? And that is still one of the fundamental drivers, is just wanting to understand the complexity of life over over millennia, and just being curious about what's out there and what I can learn, and what the stories are, and just trying to get a better understanding of different ways you can live on this land that we live in now, right? And that was kind of the answer. That's more or less the answer I gave in my thesis defense when I was asked, like, why does archaeology matter? And I said, well, I don't know, because I think it's interesting, because I'm curious about it. But I think there's more to it now. And since the last time we talked, the last few years have really seen a shift. And one of the things that's really motivating me right now is the idea that through better understanding the history of the land we're on, that I can help contribute to truth and reconciliation that way, by helping to communicate to other people of settler backgrounds like me about the history of the land that we're on. It'll help us come to terms with kind of the land that we live on and the other people that live on this land with us. So that's the big picture motivation right now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. And that's kind of, I think that's kind of the thing that I think most people in like Western society, we struggle with, right? Because we do have that concept of like our ancestors came here and settled this empty land, or however you want to put it, right? And there's some understanding that like Indigenous people were here, but I don't think the extent to which they were here was fully understood, or is fully understood. And then you're right, like, and then going into the more political side of it, right? The Truth and Reconciliation Commission and all that kind of stuff, that's all applicable to forest management and our understanding of the forest, right? And I think it's crucial that as many people as possible understand it, right? So it's interesting that you're coming to a similar understanding that I'm coming to, and that right now seems like the time, out of all of the time that this has existed, right? That Canada has existed, this seems like the time that we can really start to, I don't know, expand that knowledge and expand the opportunity for comprehensive understanding of the forest, and like you said, truth and reconciliation for First Nations people, for sure.
Yeah, start coming to terms with it and start changing our relationship to the land that we live on.
Yeah, for sure. So how do you think, let's dive into that a little further. How do you think, or walk me through your perspective and how it's changed from, being a kid to all the way through your career? How has that changed over time, and how did some of your preconceived notions of what wilderness is or what the forest is, how are those changed over time?
Yeah, well, I remember I've had the opportunity to work in the Swan Hills area quite a bit, and kind of been looking back at that area over the last winter. And it's reminding me when I was a kid, when I was 11, 12, 13, my dad and I would go up to the Swan Hills and spend some time in a trapping cabin that two of his brothers ran there. And I remember my experience in the forest there was very much I think the traditional kind of colonial narrative, right? I remember thinking of it as this vast woodland, right? Untouched nature. And even when I started my professional career in the same place, right? In the Swan Hills, around 2002, my first seasons, it was kind of that same thing, right? Exploring these vast wildernesses. And even though I knew that I was looking for artifacts left behind by people didn't really play a big role in my awareness of the forest and the way I was thinking about it, right? It was still very much that colonial narrative of like there's these remnants of the past, but not that was an active cultural landscape that people were still living in and using. And so it's been interesting looking back at that now, like 18 years later, with a very different perspective, and realizing just how little I knew about the forest and about the fact that that culture-nature divide, right? That I remember learning about that, how artificial that idea of culture versus nature was in school, but it's taken me almost 20 years out of school to really start wrapping my head around how much of a cultural landscape a lot of the places that we go are. And so,
absolutely.
I talked about, there's been a few turning points in that, but it's been just this slowly growing awareness of how much is out there as we find more sites and we start connecting the dots between them and getting a sense of just of how rich the history in the forest is. And then that has been intertwined too with my personal experiences growing up, having kids, raising them and telling them stories, and just realizing, as I talk to them about the places that I grew up, what it must be like, or must have been like, right, to be living on the same land for not just a couple generations like my family, but for 20 generations or 30 generations, and just how rich that landscape would be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I think, I had mentioned when we were talking about this, doing this interview again, I'm sure experienced foresters kind of come to a same realization, right? Working in the same place for 20 or 30 years. And it's, at those first few seasons, you're working in the forest and it's just this vast forest, right? But 20 years down the road, every place that you go, you've got memories connected to it, right? And yeah, so that's kind of where I'm coming at it, at my work now and at my relationship with the forest now.
Yeah. Well, and imagine, like you said, right? So you're a 30 or 40 year vet in the forest industry. And like you said, every nook and cranny of the vast area that you manage. And imagine that was true for your parents and their 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 parents. And so that, imagine how much more comprehensive your understanding would be, not just at a large scale level of like, that's where this river is. This is what these ecosites are over here, but down to the plants or down to the soil or down to the rock, they know that, you know what I mean? That just the amount of information they must have that Western society is kind of just, I don't know. I don't know if we were ever privy to it. We were just kind of probably just dismissed it. And it wasn't until recently that I think people have started to make that connection. And by people, I mean, people in Western society, not so much First Nations people. But yeah, I know what you mean. It's been interesting, and it's allowed me, it took me doing the whole Good Fire podcast and then doing some more like outings in the bush with First Nations folks and kind of learning a little bit about their understanding and everything that they know that I don't know. And it opens up a whole new way of seeing things and understanding things, right? Like science is awesome. Without science, I don't know where we would be. But I think when it comes to traditional knowledge, there's a lot to offer there that, yeah, we should be willing to incorporate somehow or another, right? Or at least pay attention to in some way. So, why do you think it is? Like, do you think it's just the fact, like, why do you think your perspective changed, started to include that traditional history? Do you think it was because of your work, because of the increased number of sites that you found in the boreal, or would you think it started earlier than that? And then also at like a cultural level, you know what I mean? I feel personally that I've started to notice a cultural shift in that it seems like our entire society is moving to start to be more empathetic of First Nations people. But yeah, I just want to know kind of your story, why you think it happened for you.
I think it's a bunch of different, there's a number of different facets to it, right? And some of it is like this broader cultural awareness, right? That Canadian society is starting to come to terms with some parts of our history and open our eyes to some different aspects of it. I think part of it is the accumulation of knowledge within my profession of the archaeology of the boreal forest, right? Going from 20 years ago thinking that it was this vast empty wilderness with just a few sites here and there where sparse groups of people lived, to realizing, oh no, like this was a fully populated landscape for 15,000 plus years. But I think a big part of it is just personal experience and maturity and kind of growing up. And I know when I talk to older archaeologists at the end of their career, a lot of them make that same shift from studying the artifacts to eventually wanting to work with people. And then just it becomes about the relationships, right? And I think that's a piece of it. We tend to like start with the really specific and then it kind of grows. So that's on the professional side. And then on the personal side, a lot of it has had to do with just maturing. And like I mentioned, right, raising kids and thinking about the landscape and the world and history in a different way as you've got your own family and you're sharing stories with them and thinking about how that might relate, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So thinking about, like, I'm not sure how much, how many relationships or how much exposure you've had to like First Nations culture and that kind of thing, but I want to know what your perspective was when you compare say your appreciation, your understanding of nature, the wilderness, the forest, etc., to the understanding the First Nations people that, that still practicing and connected to their traditions, what they understand. When you compare the two understandings, how do you quantify them? Like, how would you explain the difference between the two? Because I think there is a vast difference.
Yeah, I can't comment. I don't have anywhere near as much experience actually working with First Nation people as I would like to.
Sure.
I've got some experience working with First Nation people on archaeology projects. And I've got some experience working in doing technical reviews and that sort of thing, and working with the reports and data, traditional land use data a lot. But then specifically within the area of like heritage and history and culture, like you talked a little bit about how Western science is learning a lot from Indigenous knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. Archeology, it seems to come and go within our profession, how open we are to different ideas. But in comparing them, one of the big things that's really standing out to me right now is how much archaeology is really focused on the objects, right? The things that we can find, and then trying to put the stories together, and how small a piece of life that really represents. And when you start reading, whether it's traditional land use or oral history, and start hearing those kinds of stories, there's so much more going on there that we can only guess at from the material remains that we find. But we can still try to guess at it, right? We can still try to fill in the blanks in between what we find. But we definitely focus on different things. Yeah.
Oh no, for sure. I agree. Like, I think for me, when I try to think about it, and like, again, I don't have a traditional like First Nations perspective at all. And I don't mean to, but for me, what I've noticed is just the holistic nature. When I do speak with like friends of mine, and the holistic nature from which First Nations people come at the forest and looking at the forest and looking at the resource, right? It seems very different. Like one way I can explain it is with the podcast I did with Milo a few episodes back, Milo Mihalovic. We were talking about values and that kind of thing, and how a forester walks into a forest, and we describe forests by the stand type. So that's an aspen forest, that's a spruce forest, that's a pine forest, like that, right? By the trees, basically. And whereas a hunter would define a forest by, there's a scrape over there, there's a bull bush over there, or whatever, right? Like that's, and then a forager would say, there's a nice, nice mushroom patch over here, or there's some roses over here, or some whatever. And there's all these different ways of understanding the forest. And I think the Western society, we've quantified everything and tried to and put it into boxes and stuff. And it's important to do. It's good information and it's crucial. I still live my life by like Western science, but I feel like the traditional knowledge that I've been privy to up until this point has proven to be so much more holistic and in completing that perspective. And I think to not include it in our management system is just asking for trouble, right? So it's especially when you start to unveil some of the archaeological findings, right, that have been discovered in the last, I don't know what it is, 3 to 5 years, where it's just exploded in the boreal forest of how populated it was, right?
Yeah, and how rich some of those sites are. So yeah, archaeology, right, it's a Western science, and so it's reductionist, and it's about compartmentalizing, and like one of our fundamental concepts is the idea of the site, right? Very similar to an eco site, but it's the archaeological site, the place where we can find artifacts. And I think that's one of the biggest differences, right, when you start talking about that broader perspective, is that archaeologists, we tend to really focus when we go into a forest, when we go into a planned cut block, to see what we can find there, we pick out our target landforms, right? These small landforms where we believe someone in the past did something that will leave behind material remains, right? So in the boreal forest, those material remains are just almost exclusively stone chips and flakes from making tools. And so we're looking for the places where people might have lived and worked on tools or made tools. But then there's all kinds of other parts of life that didn't leave that behind that we we have a hard time looking for or documenting or putting together. So yeah, we end up just focusing in on those sites. And from a regulatory perspective too, right? It's very difficult to manage a thing that you can't see, right? And that you can't touch. And it's hard to manage the cultural landscape, the stories that are on the land. So that's, it's a similar challenge in that way, and that there's way more going on out there, but we have to kind of look up and see the forest, right? And rather than just the individual trees, the individual sites.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. And has there been any attempt into your understanding, and I'm not sure how they would quantify this for Western like scientific papers and that kind of thing to, you know, quote unquote proof. Has there been any attempt to collaborate with First Nations people around like, hey, we found this site. Do you have any, like, does anybody in, you know, your nation have any knowledge around what this might be? Because that's the nature of First Nations people's history, right? It's a storytelling thing. It's passed down, and you never know what might come up, right? So I wonder if there's been any attempt to try to do something like that.
Yeah, I think there's been lots of attempts, and there's lots of good examples of that working in collaborative projects. Mostly those are coming out of more the academic side of things, academic research. The cultural resource management side of archaeology that we do is, you know, it's similar to, it's a regulatory process. It's a technical process. It's very compartmentalized. And so it's been a lot harder to do that within our work. And it's one of the real limitations that we're trying to work through. I think if you go into a place like BC, where they have a different regulatory regime that actually mandates the involvement of First Nation people in the archaeological fieldwork and interpretation, I think you have a lot more of that going on. There's a much better integration of traditional land use, oral history, and the archaeological work. Here in Alberta, we don't have that at this point. We're working towards it, and I'm really excited. I think in the next few years, we are going to see some real strides in that direction. There have been a few really good projects, and focusing on the north. One of the best projects was with Denetah First Nation and another archaeology company that some colleagues of mine that were working in the Northwest, and have, by working together, you know, on piecing together the history of the land and where to look, they've completely changed the complexion of the archaeological history of the northwestern part of the province. So there are some good examples out there, but within kind of the everyday practice of consulting archaeology, it's not as widespread. So it's in a very similar place to forestry.
Right. And correct me if I'm wrong, but from our conversation last time, it was like episode 13. It was real early on in the podcast, so it wasn't my best work, but you were good. But we were talking about like what you actually do and how you actually do it. And if I remember correctly, it's that like when there's a proposed like harvest site or something like that, archaeologists are called to ensure that there won't be any infringement on, you know, archaeological finds and that kind of thing. And so you're really just out there to minimize any kind of damage, just kind of pinpoint where it is and say, hey, stay away. You're not digging it up and pulling it all back and doing a bunch of research on it. You're just saying, hey, there's a site here, leave it alone, kind of thing, right? Yeah,
in the context of forestry.
Right, yeah.
Because it's much easier to just cut a site out of a cut block, right? To find a site, put a buffer, figure out how big it is, get an idea of what that site represents, put a buffer on it, and leave it intact. Yeah. And so because most of the work in northern Alberta has been done in the context of forestry outside the oil sands region, we don't have a whole lot of excavations that tell us a whole lot more about what those sites are. There's been a couple of projects though, and this is, I think, what we're hinting at in terms of the changes over the last few years. There have been a couple of major pipeline projects and a couple other projects where the avoidance is not as easy an option. And so we've had some excavations done, and that is, I think, we haven't fully figured out or finished processing all the data from those excavations, both our company and some other companies. But I think that's going to really change the way we look at the forest. I know personally, It's changed the way I look at some of these sites, because when we are able to put some more work into them, we're seeing, I'd come to the understanding that there's a lot of sites out there and that they're richer than we thought they were 10 or 15 years ago. But in the last year, having excavated about 15 sites, we're seeing they're even more interesting and complex than I thought they were even just a couple of years ago. And large. Yeah, that's being able to open up block excavations and see whole distributions of artifacts and get a lot more datable artifacts. So things like projectile points that change through time and tell us how old sites are, finding more burnt bone from ancient fire pits or hearths, and getting some radiocarbon dates off of those. So because archaeology is we advance through like positive feedback. The more we learn, the better a job we can do next time. I'm really optimistic in the next few years that we're going to start seeing a lot more results coming out.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm sure to like the First Nations people, it's probably no surprise that you're finding more and more, but it definitely is to like the Western society and that kind of thing. And so, let's just dive into some of those sites that you've found and like how that has changed the Western science's perspective of the boreal forest and the interactions of people with it and that kind of thing.
Yeah, so I don't know if I can speak for all of Western science, but I can speak for
generally
myself
speaking, right? Yeah.
my colleagues. Yeah, there's been a few for us that were really eye-opening in terms of changing the way we looked at the landscape. I might have mentioned some of these early on, but yeah, early on, archaeology in the boreal forest, it was really focused on lakes, major rivers, looking for the big campsites, big fishing sites, that sort of thing. And so it was assumed when we started looking in forestry cut blocks, we wouldn't find a lot. But then every time you find a site, you kind of get a better idea where to look next. And from about 2000 to about 2010, we slowly built up a body of knowledge. And then around 2010, we started finding a lot of sites, and LiDAR really helped with that. We had talked about that before, that being able to see what the landscape looks like and really pick the spots that we want to, that are most likely to have sites at them. And so that kind of opened it up to say, oh, there's going to be a lot of sites out there. And so we need to be looking in more places. And so that's been, I think, one of the first big changes is getting away from those rivers and major streams and getting up into what I call the hinterlands, right? Remote locations, wetlands, little hummocks, really high ground, way back in the middle of nowhere. I think when we spoke last time, I talked about, it was shortly after, I think the season after we found about a 10,000-year-old spear point, a Scottsbluff style spear point, on a little hill in a little muskeg, way back up in the Swan Hills. And since then, we've been targeting more of those types of landscapes and finding a lot more sites there. And it's filling in, it's not just people traveling up and down streams. It's people living way back up in the hills, and back in kind of these remote wetlands. And then when you start looking into the traditional land use information, you find out how rich an environment those wetlands are, those muskegs, right? There's all kinds of plants, all kinds of medicines that are only available there.
Yeah. Well, especially at the top of Swan Hills there, right? There's the only place that, correct me if I'm wrong, it's one of the only places that wasn't glaciated, right?
Yeah, well, we're not 100% sure of that, but it looks like it, yeah. Like you get up on top of the Swan Hills and you've got tertiary gravels up there with almost no glacial sediment, so it might have been exposed. Right. So that's been another thing that's really changed in the last few years. Big picture is our understanding. You probably heard of the idea of the ice-free corridor.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
That Peace River, right?
Well, there's this idea that the Rocky Mountain Laurentide Glacier and the glacier over the Hudson's Bay, the Laurentide and the Cordilleran glaciers merged in Alberta for the whole ice age, right? That it was just like a solid sheet of ice. But using LiDAR and using a lot more geological information, the Alberta Geological Survey has been working on updated maps of what the glacial landforms through the foothills look like. And there's an interesting theory or a reevaluation coming out that that it was maybe not necessarily an ice-free, either a closed or open corridor up the foothills for people to travel through as the glaciers retreated, but that it might have been much patchier, right? And the Swan Hills kind of fits into that there might have been open landscapes thousands of years earlier than we have typically talked about, right? So
what exactly would that mean? Just to dive into that a little bit, what exactly would that mean for cultural findings and that kind of thing?
So one of the big things is like maybe we should be looking in other places for much older sites. Our understanding of when the earliest people would have lived in Alberta archaeologically was largely based on the assumption that the glaciers completely covered almost the whole province up until 13,000 years ago, something along those lines.
Yeah, there was sorry, I was doing the that Indigenous Canada course from the U of A or whatever, and I think her name is Tracy Bear. I can't remember. Anyway, so she was pointing out that in the traditional knowledge, they say it's more like 40,000 years that people have been on this landscape. So like it's a huge difference.
It is a huge difference, and we don't and I think one of the things as archaeologists coming to terms with the limits of our knowledge is we don't really know, right? We
you only know what you find. Yeah.
Yeah, we know what we find. And some of the findings that have come out is we know for sure there were people in Yukon 26,000 years ago, and there's some pretty likely findings further south, like all the way down to Chile around 16,000 years ago, but we don't have any really old findings in Alberta. And is that because it was covered by ice, or is it because we haven't been looking in the right places? So yeah, when we start talking about these high uplands that we're starting to target for survey a little bit more, some of these landforms that might be they might have been streams in a glacial landscape. And so we're starting to look for those things a little bit more, and maybe we'll start finding some of that evidence, but it's few and far between at this point.
Yeah. Well, like you said, you're only finding the stuff that doesn't biodegrade, right? So the stone tool tips and whatever else. So it's as it is, it's hard enough to find evidence.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. It's tough to find, but some of those, the more we find, for every 10 sites, we might find a tool, and for every 10 tools, one might be a point, and those points changed over time. So we can tell how old they are. And we might start getting some more sense, especially if we start looking in the right places, right? If we go back 20 years ago, we're only looking next to streams, then we're only going to find fairly recent sites from when those streams were where they are now. So right, as we look at the landscape with a different eye and look at a longer time scale and start looking for landforms that might be 10, 15,000 years old, we might find the sites that are on them.
Yeah.
So I think
sorry, go ahead.
Oh,
no, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, so that's like the one big change is that we're looking at for sites in more places than we were a few years ago, even. Right. We're getting away from that assumption that people just would have traveled up and down watersheds, right, up and down water courses, and starting to look for other types of sites in other places. One of the other big ones is big, high hilltops, and there's some of those in the Swan Hills, and that's an interesting one because when you're in a pre-harvest cut block on one of these big hills, it's kind of it's tough to understand why you'd want to be up there. But if you go into those, go to those sites post-harvest, and all of a sudden you can realize you can see for 10 kilometers, right, in every direction. And again, that might speak to a lot of time depth. It might speak to those sites being occupied at a time before the forests closed around them, right, when it was grassland. Or it might comment, and I know you've talked about this a little bit too, that the fact that the forest we see today is maybe a pretty recent development, that that it was a lot more open, a lot patchier in the past.
Yeah, exactly. There's so much to learn and so much to try to understand, and also to try to incorporate that knowledge into what we're doing today and how it changes what we do, right? There's so much to unpack. So can you start to paint a picture a little bit of the kind of the scope and like the breadth to which First Nations people were within the boreal forest over, you know what I mean? Out of the findings that have come up in the last however many years, the last, recent 5 years or whatever it was, because I know it's the last like 3 to 5 years, right? That you guys have, not just you, but as a whole, started to find a lot more sites in the forest itself because you're looking more, right?
Yeah, I think it's really picked up over the last 5 years.
Right.
And getting a better understanding in terms of like the breadth of it. It's like literally everywhere, right? I think I might have told this before that like every time you're out there and you think you're in a place no one's ever been, you find something that was left by someone in the past. And so I think we have to, definitely the sense I have now is that there is nowhere out there that wasn't used in the past. And if we look hard enough in any area, we're going to find evidence of that. And so, do we really need all of that evidence to say that? I don't know, but it certainly helps us tell the story, and it helps us understand and wrap our heads around how deep that time depth is and how broad it is too. That people have lived in the entire landscape, right? That it was never that empty forest, right? That empty, untouched wilderness that we grew up thinking of the forest as. That probably the only time it was that empty was, the middle 20th century, when traditional users were really limited in their access.
Yeah, you really start to paint an interesting picture about like the effect of colonization and like bring a comprehensive understanding to the time and place that we are now, both in Western culture and in Indigenous culture, and like how we got here and what that means for the future, right? It's interesting that these things are all just coming together now, and it's trying to make sense of it and what it means and how to incorporate that knowledge into future plans is...
Yeah. There's a couple other areas, right, that have really, really expanded. But again, it's that kind of that holistic view, right, is a really important part of it too, that I think that some of what we find can help change the way we look at the forest from, we looking at it from with these Western eyes for however many generations. And that's been reflected in how we do the archaeology too, that if we go back 10, 20 years, right, it was very much this notion of the forest as a place you go out to gather resources, right? And we'd find the archaeological interpretations were these small sites that probably represented a hunter, looking out for game. Mm-hmm. But then I think over the last few years, we started finding some bigger sites, and we started finding some different activities represented by the artifacts that we find. So one of the really cool ones that came up a few years ago was a trapping cabin. And it was probably early 20th century, like 1920s, thereabouts. And it had some cans, and some of the cans still had legible labels on them. And one of the labels was baby formula. And that's one that really struck home to us. It's like, oh, hold on. Like, it wasn't just these hunters and trappers, these men going out and gathering resources, right? Like, people were living here. Whole families were living here, and they were doing more than just what me growing up. That's what the forest was for, is this place we'd go out to hunt or to fish, and then we'd go home. And that's not necessarily what life has always been like and how it's always been looked at. Mm-hmm. And we're also finding there's been a few features that have turned up in archaeological sites over the last few years, that stone features, basically piles of stones that aren't necessarily fire cracked. Like, people might have heard of fire cracked rock or stone boiling on the plains. It was really common to use hot rocks to boil water to either cook food or to boil grease out of bones to make pemmican. And we've found a couple cases, not on forestry work, but I've heard of them, and they're coming out. And I think we're going to see more of this, of stone piles that aren't cracked, that probably represent sweats, right? And I know I've seen these. I've seen recent sweat lodges, and that's probably something that's been going on out there for millennia, and is going to leave a material record, but is not easy to find or necessarily easy to recognize, especially if you're not looking for it. So it's things like that are really changing some of the perspectives on how we look at the forest, and again, trying to bring that a more holistic approach or understanding. So,
how do you think that this more holistic approach that we're trying to accomplish, more empathetic and understanding approach, how do you think that applies? Like, how do we apply that to our policies and the way we do things? Like, how do you think it should, and how do you think it will change things? That's a big question. I know it's probably outside of your comfort level, but I'm going to ask you anyways.
I think specific to forestry and the practice of forestry, even in my career, which hasn't been that long, I've seen huge changes in the number of values that foresters are being asked to balance on the landscape.
Yeah.
I think that's something, it was always part of that job, was trying to balance, timber values and modern, the need for timber now versus the need for timber later and all these things. But now there's all of these other values on the landscape, right? Traditional uses and traditional plants and animal populations and fish habitat and all of these different needs, and balancing those. And some of the cultural values are coming into that too. And I'm starting to see them get integrated at, I think, higher levels in overall planning. And that's encouraging. And
yeah, it is.
Yeah. And there's a point too where there's, to a certain extent, what I do in terms of archaeology has been acting as kind of a proxy for watching out for traditional values. And as First Nation engagement and consultation has been improving, I think that role is going to not be as important a part or as big a part of what I'm doing, because that's not what I should be doing, right? That's up to First Nations. And I think going forward, we'll hopefully see that show up in my practice or profession too, right? As more consultation and engagement and interpretations to give us a more holistic interpretation. I think one of the big changes that we're going to see in archaeology is the question of valuation of sites or evaluation of sites, right? Like when we find something, how important it is.
Right.
That's historically and in our regulatory process is based almost exclusively on what we consider the scientific information potential, right? Like, what are the artifacts we find? How many of them are there? What's the variety? What can it tell us about life in the past? Mm-hmm. But going forward, there's a lot more. If we look at, for example, settler history, more recent history, like built structures, there's a lot more going on in terms of how we value heritage than just its scientific or architectural information potential, right? There's the stories that are connected to the place are a really important part of how we value our own heritage. And so I think that's one of the big changes that's going to happen, is we're going to have to figure out how to engage in a more holistic process for valuing these sites and landscapes.
Absolutely. I think that's true for any organization or any industry that operates on public land, right? It's just becoming more and more. And I think it's happening in a lot of places. It's happening voluntarily, right? As the recognition comes to light, people are going, oh, okay, well, now this is something that has to be part of our toolbox.
The fact that, it's not being driven by regulation, right? That one of the really encouraging pieces is that some of these challenges are being picked up by industry and by communities through consultation and engagement without necessarily the regulatory enforcement or backing. That people are just seeing it's the right thing to do and it's the way to move forward together. Yeah. And so that's encouraging to see, right? That
absolutely.
We're moving in that direction on our own. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people would agree. A lot of people would disagree, but I think a lot of the benefit comes from recognizing, I think first and foremost, when it comes to consultation in quotations, right? We need to recognize that there are people in Canada that are hurting disproportionately more than everybody else. And those people are First Nations people. And we have to ask ourselves why, and then we have to look into, okay, well, how can we begin to solve this issue? And more directly, when you look at something like oil and gas or forestry or whatever it is, why not work collaboratively and see the collaborative effort and the collaborative benefit that can come out of having good relationships and working together, right? And yeah, it means you won't get to do things the way you want to do them, but it means you'll get to do things the right way with everybody involved and with the most potential for success and long-term sustainability, right? It's just, I think as a culture, where people are just starting to recognize the importance and the impact that the decisions we make have on the world and the future of humanity. And one of those groups of people that have been left in the dust, in Canada at least, has been First Nations people. And I think anybody that has the opportunity or the power to help out needs to reach out. And I think it seems like that's where people are headed, right? Like, people want to be involved and they want to be on the right side of history.
Yeah. And I think that right side of history is a really important part of it, right? Is I think wanting to make a difference and leave a mark and help things move in the right direction is I think it's where a lot of us are coming to things right now. And
yeah, it's been interesting. And like, the archaeological stuff really fascinates me, because is there any, like, do you guys, when you come across a site, do you have to inform, or do you voluntarily inform the local, and not necessarily will that site be from the local First Nations people, right? It could be, who knows, like, things change over time. But is that information made available to First Nations folks?
It's not right now.
It's not.
In terms of, there's no regulatory mandate for it. And it's actually, it gets pretty tricky in a regulatory perspective. So Alberta is working to open up some of those lines of communication. But yeah, we're not in Alberta. We're not at a place now where we necessarily consult on those projects, right? And I think that is where it's heading, right? If we look at the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, I think it's pretty clear in there that we should not be making decisions about what happens to sites without talking to Indigenous people who might have an interest in or a historical connection to those sites.
Yeah, absolutely. So is it something where, like, would you get in trouble? Or is it just something where, like, it's not done? There's no framework in place to do it.
It's tricky.
It's just tricky. 10-4, gotcha.
I've made a couple of missteps. So, working on, like, I've done work for First Nations and I've done work for industry. And when you're working for industry, you got to be careful about communication and stepping on the toes of the other people working for industry who are engaged in consultation. There's some risk there. There's risks around what's shared and what the ramifications of that could be. And that can put us in a tricky spot. And then working for First Nations, to try to help nations negotiate with the government, or not necessarily negotiate, but navigate more through the information that's available, because I've been doing it for 20 years, so it seems pretty clear to me. But when you dive into things like the listing of historic resources and the Archeological Survey of Alberta, they're full of pretty technical knowledge, and you have to read a lot between the lines to understand what's really going on in those technical reports.
Of course.
And so it's tricky, right? And I would like to find a middle ground where we can work in collaboration. And that's what we're trying to work towards, but we're not there yet.
Yeah. Well, it seems to me like, for example, as a forest professional, it's in my regulatory body, right? Like, my duty first and foremost is to the people of Alberta and the people of Canada, right? The people of Alberta, because that's where I'm registered through. And so my duty is to the people of Alberta and their values, not to the company or not to the whoever's hired me or whatever, right? And it's interesting that archaeology doesn't have that safety or freedom, or, you know what I mean? Like, it should be. It sucks that you have to be bound by those complicated and tricky legal things, right? Like you'd think that archaeology would be more like that. Like this information first and foremost belongs to the public, not to whoever paid for it.
Yeah,
because it's public. It is public space and public stuff, right? So.
Yeah, and the information and we are to some extent, right? So our reporting, it's an unusual way the permitting and reporting system is set up, in that our permit is issued by the government and our report goes to the government, right? Which in theory is representing the people of Alberta. And so that everything we're doing, and this is one of the watchwords within my team, right, is we put the archaeology first, right? But sometimes putting the archaeology first isn't the same thing as being really open and transparent to everybody involved. And so, that's where there's a lot of different stakeholders to try to keep in mind.
Doing the right thing isn't always black and white. It's tricky for sure. Yeah. I feel for you guys. Yeah, it's tough. It's tough. But so when it comes to like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and that kind of thing, how do you see this all? How do you see your role in that, like fitting into everything else?
Well, I think the biggest role I see for myself, right? And I'm not going to speak for my whole profession or my whole company, but for myself, reading through the calls to action, the ones that stand out to me as the place where I can potentially make the most contribution is in kind of the educational pieces of it. Going out and learning the history of this land so that I can share it with other people, primarily people, like I mentioned, of settler background, right? People like me that are coming in and, our ancestors were, picked up, shipped off from Europe, dropped in here in the middle of nowhere, as far as they knew, right? And we lost all the connection to our own heritage, and we didn't really learn the history of the land that we're in now. And so that for me, I think, is the big one, learning those stories and teaching them and sharing them with others. Right. And so that's one of the things we try to do by blogging and presenting it in communities and conferences. And the number one, the reason I know that this is probably the biggest place I can have an impact is because the number one response we get whenever we're talking to the public, right, whenever we're doing a community presentation or writing a blog, is that people had no idea, right? They had no idea there was archaeology here, right? And they had no idea that people lived out, up in those hills. And so, I think that's the biggest area that I think that we want to focus on, and that we can, as archaeologists or heritage workers, right? I think that's the number one thing that we can do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It makes perfect sense because, like we were talking about at the very top of the podcast, right? There's so many people out there, like myself included, that I feel like are just starting this journey of trying to better understand the history of this land, right? And the importance of that and how that changes the decisions we make. And I think, like you said, your work and people like you, the work that you guys do is perfectly exemplifying what's going on out there and what did happen out there. And you're able to show people and prove it to people and convince people that this is what was happening. And I think that's like crucially needed, right? Like, how are people supposed to empathize with the people if they don't really understand what they were doing and how they were doing it and the impact they had on the natural world that we all have grown to love, right? So I think that's absolutely crucial to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, right? Is to just help us understand it better.
Yeah, and I think the tactile nature of it, right? The nature that we're dealing with physical evidence, it makes I've found in my experience, right, it makes for kind of a relatively easy entry into those conversations, because you can start from the specific and expand from there, and you can start from something that's real and physical, and then start talking about what that tells us and how that fits into the bigger picture. And in a different way than trying to come at it from more modern history, and like, for example, from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, right? Where, there's it's easy to get people's back up if you start really coming at it from that angle, because it's a tough topic, and it's a tough topic especially for those of us who are relatively new to this land to kind of come to terms with, what's the position, how the position we're in right now comes out of that history. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, and every time I do an episode where we talk about, First Nations people, and, I did one on treaties and like whatever, I'm always a little nervous because I want to be inclusive, and I want to portray the, helpful ideas, and not continue some harmful way of thinking that's going to make it harder for truth and reconciliation to happen, right? So it's tough for, we got two European, white dudes talking about, talking about First Nations values and that kind of thing. Even that in and of itself, it's not lost on me, right?
Yeah.
So, is there anything else you wanted to get into before we ask that kind of final question where you're talking about like what is important about archaeology? Is there anything else you wanted to get to before we ask that question?
I don't think so. We've kind of, it's been a meandering path, but I think we've gotten to most of the places, right?
Yeah. So let's do that then.
Yeah.
Answering that question from your masters, what's important about archaeology?
And I think right now, that's the big one, is that it's a way for us, right, those of us with Western backgrounds, to start understanding that history from a perspective that is easier for us to understand, right? I think it's going to be really important for us to start learning more about Indigenous perspectives and world views too, but that's not my place, right? But yeah, why does it matter? It gives us some of that perspective. It tells us what happened in the past, and by understanding the past, it helps us understand how we got to where we are now, and that'll help us set up for the future, right? That'll help us to figure out how we're going to move forward and in what direction. So
yeah, no, exactly. It's funny talking about, like, I had Peter Murphy on a couple times talking about history and that kind of thing, and I asked him the same question a couple times, and it's I don't know why it's such a hard question to answer in any kind of emotionally connected way. Is why is understanding history important? You know what I mean? Because I think everyone can kind of say, oh yeah, it's important to know what happened so we know what we should do, right? But it's funny that it always just it's a hard question to answer, but it is crucial, right? Like it's absolutely essential for us to understand that we're moving forward the right way. So I don't know why it's such a challenging question.
Yeah, and we didn't even get into, maybe that's a topic for another talk, is like the settler history that's out in the forests and the settler archaeology, right? Old logging camps and that sort of thing. But that's part of it too, and part of the story. And I didn't really. One of the bigger ways that I'm looking at things too, I touched on it a little bit, is that sense of us as the descendants of settlers being picked up and dropped into this place without our heritage and our connection to history and our connection to the land. And I think learning that and understanding that, I think we'll make different decisions about how we move forward and how we use this land and interact with this land if we have a stronger connection to it, right? I think it's been easy for us to drop in and just focus on resource extraction, right? And just focus on kind of more shorter term and short-term gains, and not see sustainability because we don't have, 15,000 years of family history connected to this land, right? We don't see that big picture. Just having a better understanding of that, I think, would change some of the decisions we make and the time horizon that we're thinking at.
Yeah. I think up until recently, especially, 50, 100 years ago or more, when it comes to the Western society, we kind of saw Canada's wilderness as like untappable, like just so vast that you couldn't possibly make a dent in it. So don't worry about it. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And it isn't until like the last, 40, 50 years that we've started to really understand the impact that human beings can have. And yeah, you're right. I think a lot of it has to do with that lack of connection to the land besides like, oh, that's pretty. Right. That traditional connection that First Nations people have is I think it's just like, I think about myself, like I've dedicated my entire life to the forest, right? To nature and sustainability and that kind of thing. But I still think like it's important. It's important to me, but I still think there's a different value to, and a deeper value, a deeper understanding to the forest and to nature from First Nations people than there is from me. I can only be so close to it when I didn't spend every waking moment in it, and my ancestors didn't spend every waking moment in it, learning from it and depending on it completely, right? Like, I don't think it's possible for me to understand it the way that their ancestors did, right? Even when I think about I spend a week out in the bush by myself hunting. By the end of that week, I feel so much more in tune with everything. There's things I'm noticing that I never would notice before. And I can't imagine how that would change over a lifetime. If you spent a lifetime in the bush by yourself with no distractions, right? Depending on it for food and everything else. So I think, there's a connection there that we need to, I think we're just starting to tap into as a Western culture and starting to understand a little more and starting to incorporate and try to, I don't know, I guess, just incorporate that understanding into how we do things so that, like I said before, we're on the right side of history. Cause it's tough.
And just figuring out that we're a part of it and it's all connected. Right. So.
Yeah. Like the First Nations people were as much of the landscape as the moose and the soil and the rocks, and they were a part of the ecology. Right. And the truth could be said for us. We're just a lot more disconnected from it as a society. So this is great, man. I appreciate you taking the time to provide your perspective, and we can always do this again as more and more information comes out. I think it's got a lot of value.
Yeah. Well, thanks again for the chance to talk about it.
Thanks a lot for listening, everybody. I hope you liked that. I really like talking to Kurtis. There's a lot of richness there, a lot of deep thoughts, and a lot of interesting things to contemplate. And I hope to continue to have conversations like this with people for a very long time. So thank you, Kurtis, for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to keeping up with you and talking more about this kind of stuff because it's really cool. So remember to share with a friend, tell a friend, share it on Facebook, on social media, Instagram, Twitter, all that. That really helps a lot. Rate and review, all those things help tremendously. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to talking to you guys next time. Take it easy.